Welcome to follow this panel discussion from this auditorium and also from the internet. The main theme of the research day is science is necessary but not sufficient. And the title of this panel discussion is Research and Decision Making, What Should We Do Now? Let me start by introducing our panelists. We have two panelists who have already been speakers in this morning. We have Dr. David Michaels. He's Assistant Secretary of U.S. Department of Labor, which is a key position in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He also has a background as professor in George Washington University, so he has a double role in this discussion between research and decision making. Then we have Mr. Olli-Pekka Heinonen, who is State Secretary in Prime Minister's office, so he has a key position now in political decision making in Finland. Then we have Suomaa, who is Director General of the Department of Occupational Safety and Health in the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. And then Riitta Työläjärvi, who is Senior Advisor of Social and Health Policy in the Finnish Confederation of Professionals. So we have a very good team for discussing the topic of research and decision making. Let me start by summarizing some of the issues. We have already heard very interesting lectures in this morning, how research may help to prevent occupational ill health, what constitutes evidence, how wicked problems require novel solutions, and also a statement on Bayesian decision theory by Jorma Rantanen. Now the key issue here is the problem of evidence-based policy or evidence-based decision making. Such decision making needs values which come from the politicians as decision makers, but it also needs knowledge which should be provided by research, evidence-based research. But as we know, all such research outcomes are uncertain, so that creates the issue of decision making under uncertainty. The traditional model for such interaction has been that knowledge is produced in special institutes like universities and state sectorial research institutes, research performing organizations such as the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health and the National Institute for Health and Welfare. And then this knowledge is transferred to the users of knowledge, who may come from ministries and parliaments as political decision makers. They may be officials in the public sector. They may be persons in the private sector, in industries, or citizens who are using this kind of knowledge to moderate their own behavior. Now, today the situation is much more complex, as Olli-Pekka Heinonen's lecture also illustrated. It's more complex and more messy, and that is partly due to new technologies of information and communication. We are speaking now of co-creation of knowledge, where the producers and users of of knowledge are working together. We have the trend of open science and open access via internet, where all information is freely available, but at the same time there is not always guarantee that the information is valid or qualified or really assured for its quality. And we also need all kinds of new actors who mediate between research activities and decision makers, and in many cases the relevant knowledge already exists. We need kind of summaries of the new research findings, but in many cases we need new research, even basic research to find solutions. In the European context, we hear much talk about grand challenges of environment, health, aging population, etc. And the European Union is investing quite a lot of funding for such grand challenges. And we also speak about wicked problems, as was illustrated by Heinonen's talk, which have hard problems which need multidisciplinary approaches, and in many cases joint activities from natural sciences, medicine, and the humanities and the social sciences. In Finland we have the ongoing reform of the research institutes. The government has decided to create a new fund for strategic research with 70 million euro, which is partly collected from the Academy of Finland and partly from the now existing research institutes, and that this funding will be then open for applications, but the main themes will be defined by the government. And the Emeritus Chancellor Kari Raivio from the University of Helsinki has now the task of giving a report how the political leaders should be advised in issues concerning science and science policy, and we know that he has advocated the idea of chief scientific advisors, which is used in Great Britain. Now, in this panel we can now discuss all these issues about the interaction between research and decision making, and I would first like to as a warm-up, to ask the panelists to give, in your experience as researchers or decision makers, to mention one good example of how research has been used in decision making in a successful way. That would be the first question, and then I would like to, as the second round, ask what in your view would be the best way of promoting this kind of evidence-based policy, or what are the most difficult obstacles for successful evidence-based policy. And after that, I think we should also give the floor to the audience and have some questions from the audience. So let's proceed in this order. David Michaels.
Thank you. Actually, I want to go back to something that Jos was saying, the use of evidence and how we interpret it. I watched an interesting process recently where, as I mentioned, we have 3 new randomized trials on the inspection effects, the effects of OSHA inspections. I know you've just finished a collaborative on this. And they all actually showed that we had some impact. And I thought about this and said, well, if they didn't, I'm not sure we would have changed our behavior, because the law says this is what we should do. And it raised a very important question. We're very grateful that they came up with the answer that concurred with what we do. But there are certainly many activities that we do which we have no evidence that they actually are effective. We believe they're effective. And certainly in the world which I'm currently living in, which is government policies around workplace safety, there's the assumption that if we reduce exposure, we will have the impact we want. And I think with chemical exposures, that's pretty straightforward. But the issues that you raised in general are really very challenging ones. And you certainly, I wish I could offer you a better example of this, but I can't. And we change policies slowly, and even though we know that, for example, beryllium being an interesting example, the question came with what metals are from the metal industry. The beryllium industry for many years claimed that beryllium didn't cause beryllium disease at low levels, it didn't cause cancer. The beryllium industry has come around. It actually has come to us and said we really want to protect workers better, and voluntarily they do that. But our ability to change our policy is many years behind what industry can do and often will do. So in some ways, from my point of view, our policies are paralyzed, and not for scientific reasons, but for political and legal reasons. And so we don't make decisions based on science.
Okay, Olli-Pekka Heinonen.
Yes, thank you. It's a very difficult question to tell one successful good example. What I've noticed is that the kind of culture in different fields of policy is a bit different. We do have some fields where there is a kind of a tradition of dialogue which is strong between the research scientific community and the decision making. And issues concerning, for example, the kind of national economics is such an area. That there is this kind of a culture of dialogue. The challenge there is, again, that it is kind of a silo. And in both ends, on the political decision-making side, it's a kind of a silo phenomena, and also on the research side, it's a kind of a silo phenomena. And I think there's interesting work being done by OECD at the moment. It's called New Approaches for Economic Challenges. NICE is the name of the project, where the idea is exactly bringing a kind of multidisciplinary approach also to economic issues. So kind of combining, not looking at economic issues only as kind of economics, but looking at actually from also, for example, from the behavioralist point of view, and actually combining, they are combining kind of life sciences and they are kind of combining ICT at the same issue in order to be able to anticipate that the things that happened in 2007 and 2008 wouldn't happen again in the world. And I think at least it's a better drive than we have done before.
Okay, then Riitta Työläjärvi.
So good morning everybody. And well, thanks for a good start for this panel. I'll try to be very concrete and share not only one but a couple of practical examples that have been very useful and appreciated by the Finnish employees and trade unions. As you probably know, the Finnish social partners are very committed to the activities that deal with extension of working careers. And I think as a whole, the Finnish Institute for Occupational Health has been contributing very widely and has produced very valuable information for us in order to proceed in these activities. Well, maybe I would like to especially mention the work by Professor Ahonen and colleagues, not only the economic analysis and very practical examples that have shown that when the enterprises invest in worker well-being and health and safety, it's very good business, and these human investments will give very good profits by time. It has been a language that the enterprises understand, and it has helped us as well in our work to negotiate and to promote the worker health and safety. And it has been a very valuable input. Also in the legislation, I think we have quite a list of good examples where the scientific research and its implementation to the practical step has been very valuable, and especially the research by the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. For example, we have just recently revised and renewed the degree for occupational health services, and in quite a number of paragraphs there we have been using the valuable information of the researchers. For us in the organization or central organization for professionals, STTK, for us it's important to promote the psychosocial risks and their management and assessment. And I think we have got quite a few very good paragraphs in order to help the practical work in the workplaces. Also, for example, sexual harassment, working times, how to take them into account in the workplaces, how they influence the well-being at work, and how the occupational health services should deal with these issues. And once again, the Finnish Institute for Occupational Health has provided very valuable research and information about these issues. The needle stick decree as well. Well, this is one of the points where clearly the United States has been before Europe. Luckily, we also have some progress in this area now, and we have a new decree on the needle stick injuries, and these are very practical examples in the workplace level work, and also when we think of the legislation, and where we have quite a solid and firm basis in the scientific research.
Thank you. And then Leo Suomaa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been working in the ministry for 30 years, and main part of that time I have been drafting legislation. And if I take so the general answer is that I have used research results in drafting legislation. But if I highlight something, when Finland drafted a new Occupational Safety and Health Act, it was after the bad economic times, and during that time I had time to read all the academic dissertations from the 40s to the beginning of 90s and make a memorandum for myself, not only 104 pages, it was more than 1,000 pages. And I was quite well prepared to take the chair of the drafting committee after that exercise. All of the academic resource was in my memorandum already there. But that was for my personal use. The most clear examples are asbestos legislation. I was a young civil servant drafting the first pieces of those decrees that led to total prohibition of the use of asbestos in the 1980s, 1990s. And another example was the banning of tobacco smoking in the restaurants. I was the chair of the working group, and there was no disagreement as regards the evidence base. There was some discussions concerning the economic and social and other effects of that kind of legislation. But anyway, we used the research evidence and we were lucky enough. Then, as Riitta referred to, we have some perhaps big problems. For instance, the continuation or extending of working careers. We have not been able to pay them so far. If I take one item, the musculoskeletal disorders, we know that they are the problem, but we do not know how to tame that problem.
Okay, thanks. So this was the sort of positive picture of the influence of research to decision making. But then the next question would be, how would you propose to improve the interaction? And what do you see as the main obstacles for successful applications of research in decision making? Are there problems on the research side or in the other side of the decision makers, or other sort of interfering actors which make this communication difficult? So that would be the next round.
Let me follow up on what Leo was talking about in terms of musculoskeletal disorders, which really is, in some ways, our biggest challenge. I mean, I think it's a challenge from the research point of view, both because it's complex issues and there are many interacting causes, but also from the research point of view, it isn't sexy that we have many researchers who are interested in chemical carcinogenesis and understanding molecular interactions, often related to diseases that are quite rare. But the musculoskeletal disorders that disable a higher proportion of the working population than any other cause has attracted very little interest among researchers, very little, at least in the United States, research support from government agencies. And I think it is part of the larger construct in everybody's mind that these, destroying your back over the course of a working lifetime is something that just comes with a job. This phrase we have in English, occupational hazard, almost says, it's acceptable. Where we certainly don't have any acceptance of asbestosis or leukemia-related to benzene. The idea that someone working in a warehouse or a nurse in a hospital, after a number of years, will have a back problem from having to lift patients and move patients. And as a result of that, will have trouble lifting their children or their grandchildren. That is almost, that risk is not one that we've really taken on. And it's unfortunate both from the policy level and the research level. We don't have enough research, and the policy makers aren't pushing hard to say, how do we change work so people can retire and still have full musculoskeletal function?
If I start with the kind of hinders and obstacles, I would say that the biggest one is misunderstanding of each other's roles in the process. That I pretty often find kind of very prejudiced views from the research side that what are the motives of political decision makers, and the political decision makers side that what are the kind of motives of the scientific environment. And the problem is that if people don't talk together, it's very easy to misunderstand each other. And so I think the lack of interaction is one of the biggest obstacles that happens there today. Because of that, there's also the issue of what is the time frame that we're talking about. What is the time frame of research done, and what is the time frame of needed decision making? And do they meet each other? Could they meet better than they meet today? And I think we need not only the dialogue, but we need kind of roles that are between the research communities and the political decision makers, who try to bring these two parties closer to each other. And then we come to the question that what is on research, what is the kind of user orientation of the evidence found? That if it's a kind of a report, and the idea is that it would be, for example, a political decision maker would be the one who is using it, then there's a very high expectation that the political decision maker would read the report, and that expectation might even be sometimes too high. And then we come to the question that could there be kind of other forms of having the information in a more usable form for the decision makers. And of course we're talking now pretty much about, I'm talking pretty much about kind of political decision makers' point of view, but we also have the same issue if the users are citizens. That what is the kind of user orientations of research evidence for citizens, and that's something else I think we should discuss much more.
Finland is a small nation, and if we want to make it well in the global market and international competition, which is getting harder and harder all the time, we need to stay firm in quality, in skills and knowledge. And we cannot make it without the help of scientific research. And I think we have made progress in that area, but we are not quite in the optimal situation yet. For example, I have liked very much the fact sheet that the Institute has been producing lately, fact sheet for decision makers. They are very practical and compact, and in a few minutes give the most important information about certain topics. We need information, but I think information as such is not enough. We need communication, and we need dialogue, and we need to discuss, and we need to listen to each other, and we need to work together. For example, when you start a research project, maybe my voice is a little bit loud anyway, but even better with a microphone. So, for example, if you plan to start a research project, I think today it's not enough to give out the information in the very end, but the researchers should be in the middle of the societies, and they should have a continuous dialogue with different partners, including social partners, that is workers and employers organizations. And from the very beginning there should be some idea how to share the results of this research. And once it's done, definitely a press conference is not enough to share the products and results of this research, but you should, as a part of your scientific work, also think how to get it to the clients, to the workplaces, to the employers and workers and their organizations. And I think that that dialogue that is needed, we are getting more and more of that all the time, and that's a very positive phenomenon. Maybe we should try to get the help of other professionals, I mean media professionals, adult education professionals. How can we share the scientific products to the everyday life, to the ordinary workers and even small, medium-sized enterprises? There are techniques and there are methods that can be easily put in practice, and definitely we shouldn't miss them. The Finnish workplaces and enterprises and workers deserve the results of scientific research in their everyday life and in their everyday working places.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my point of view, as I'm also an independent, competent authority or head of that kind of institution, there is a kind of multi-lane approach. We should fit the research results for each lane. For instance, basic research does not help us a lot at the workplace level, but it might help us on the level of the political decision making. We have to understand the basics of the thing. From my point of view, this issue is quite simple. Everything begins from leadership at the workplace level. And that's why, for instance, here in the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health, there's a network for development of leadership. And that's the new point of view as regards occupational safety and health. It's also an issue of leadership. And we have to find an appropriate point how to tackle those issues that are most important and most effective. The next step is that there on the workplace shop floor level, the entrepreneur needs help. In Finland there are 250,000 workplaces and 2.5 million employees. That means that approximately there are 10 people at the workplace. Those 10 people cannot be able to take care of all those 100 occupational safety and health pieces of legislation that exist. Someone has to help them, and it's the concept of occupational healthcare cooperation, or was that correct translation, Christine? Well, okay, that's the way how occupational healthcare services, together with the workplace occupational safety and health organization and the employer, cooperate so that they can solve the problems at the workplace level. The next step, and I refer to Riitta, is it's a good tripartite cooperation here in Finland. What we draft together, what we understand together in drafting phase, then we also implement that together. And that's the way we communicate our common understanding to the workplaces. And perhaps in this time when social media, etc., are functioning quite effectively, we have to research how to make this tripartite cooperation to win all kinds of anti-vaccination movements that are very eager in delivering disinformation. That's another research point of view. And all this must be communicated. If we do not discuss these items, we don't know, we are not aware of them, and we are not aware of, we are not able to solve. And then only we need legislation and enforcement, and it's another issue for research. For instance, the deterrence theory mentioned by Professor Michaels, it comes from jurisprudence. And we have, at least as far as I know, we do not have a real theory for the enforcement of occupational safety and health. And if I take occupational well-being at work, enforcement of well-being at work, it's more difficult. It's really basic research. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the themes which was highlighted in the lectures in this morning was this kind of dialectics between the reliability and uncertainty of scientific knowledge. Science is a self-corrective system of forming justified beliefs on the basis of evidence, experiments, etc. But it's always open to challenges from the scientists themselves. So one aspect of the reliability of science has been that it is this kind of open and self-corrective system, but that then leads to situations which I think David illustrated very vividly with the examples from examples where the industry is producing sort of counter evidence to results of studies in occupational safety and health. So that is one problem. Then we have these anti-science movements and all kinds of attacks against science by very different types of groups. So for decision makers and for citizens, it may be a little perplexing that there is this conflict of different views and interpretations, and how to then manage to do decision making in such situations where it seems to be uncertain what is the real scientific conclusion. Debates on climate change are also examples of that. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that is this on? You raise an interesting question. Is evaluation science? I think it's applying the scientific method, but it isn't necessarily science. I mean, it's not developing new knowledge. The fact that we have evaluated our enforcement program to be effective is not really, it's scientifically determined evidence, but I wouldn't call it science. It's not, if someone goes to replicate it 10 years from now, it isn't the same question in some ways. And so I think it's important to make that distinction between using rigorous methods, maybe we shouldn't call them scientific methods, but rigorous evaluation methods to help us determine and implement policy, one thing, and then the scientific basis for that policy is a different question. And I think maybe that distinction is one that it will be important to draw to then help us determine where to go with these. The science tells us that asbestos exposure causes lung cancer. And again, we can, I think, Jorma's example, it's very easy to say if we reduce exposures, or actually uses, well, if we reduce that, if we physically eliminate the exposure, we assume that will stop the lung cancer from occurring. That's straightforward. But the effectiveness of our interventions is a different sort of question. So.
Yeah, Riitta.
So now it's on. Well, that's a good point as well. And when we think of occupational safety and health, we are dealing with people and we are dealing with society. We are not only working with techniques and machines. And always when human beings are involved, there are feelings and there are emotions. And it's a fact as well that you need to consider how a human nature will react in certain situations, or how an ordinary worker will be able to cope with these instructions or operate with these machines, or how this worker will act with client situations depending on the industry. So that's part of the multidisciplinary approach you are practicing in this institution and other institutions that study subjects that deal with human beings. And on the other hand, I think it's making the work richer and more challenging to the scientists. Well, it's also a part of how to share the results of the studies, because you should also consider how the beneficiaries, how the enterprises and the workers will accept these results. What's the kind of information or dialogue so that they will be ready to accept and change their behavior if needed. And definitely, as I said, it's from our point of view, it's very advisable to use the help of education professionals, adult educators, or media persons, and how to use all the kind of possibilities, the social media, etc., for younger workers and some older workers. But on the other hand, if you try to be extremely modern and forget all about the more traditional ways of communication, that's maybe not a good balance neither, because not everybody is in Facebook and Twitter, and maybe you could make a good mixture, a good balance of how to share and deliver the results to different kinds of workers and different kinds of enterprises and workplaces. It's also a question of how to tolerate uncertainty, and I think that's an issue for the researchers, and that's an issue for the clients, for the workplaces as well. And well, I think a majority of the workplace actors, employers and workers today, they understand the basics of the probabilities and percentages, and they will be ready to accept and understand that the results are not 100% certainty, and very often the recommendations they deal with certain probabilities, and if a risk or a solution is significant, you should take it into account, although the certainty is not 100%.
My viewpoint is perhaps a little bit different. When drafting a piece of legislation in Finland, I have to keep in mind that behind the occupational safety and health legislation there is a penal code if you violate occupational safety and health legislation, you have committed to a crime, and there's a punishment in the penal code. Now, when drafting the legislation, I have to keep this in mind. That the evidence has to be such that nobody who is innocent is not sitting in jail because of our too early piece of legislation. And that's the other side of the precautionary principle. As Gurmarantanen pointed out, we have to be early enough to prevent all the illnesses of the world, but on the other hand, we have to be careful that we do not do any damage to innocent people. And I have said something sometimes to the researchers that I do not use in drafting legislation those articles that are in press. I want to see the scientific discussion, and when the results are published in the textbooks without a reference to the original source, then it just went through the scientific discussion and I can rely on that kind of result. And still there is a possibility that the science corrects itself later on.
Now in the morning discussion, Harri Vainio mentioned this recent article in The Economist, How Science Goes Wrong, where the editorial of the journal argues that experiments are not repeated and science is not really good enough. Would you, Harri, like to elaborate that point? Do you think that this kind of criticism was justified or exaggerated?
I think that this is a big issue, and there are certain critics which have been arguing that in the scientific literature today, most of the published papers are actually wrong. This is perhaps a bit of a sort of exaggerated argument, but I think that we should sort of keep in mind that actually science is in progress, and it should always sort of correct itself and gradually go towards the truth. The fact that in the Economist paper article, they actually took up this point that while there are sort of at the moment hundreds of journals which claim that they are peer-reviewed, they publish only peer-reviewed articles. In fact, the peer review is often not really done, and they tested it by sending a paper which had sort of 10 major faults in the study design, in the analysis, and in the interpretation to about 300 papers. The very top journals were excluded, but all those papers, which were the articles were sent in, they had the claim that they are using peer review. 156, if I remember correctly, of the journals accepted the paper as it was and published it. And even in those who had some some comments, then none of these comments, no paper actually pointed out all the faults which were introduced into the paper. So I think that we really have to be critical also with the so-called peer-reviewed articles, and that those should be examined. And this is why I think the thing like Cochrane activities or systematic reviews which have a neutral point of view to start from are so important that we are looking for the articles which are available. If the articles is rubbish, you just consider that it's rubbish and you put it out from your desk and don't consider it because it doesn't contribute to the evidence at all. Unfortunately, even in this field we are working. So after you go through all the published papers, sometimes you are left only with a couple of articles. And then you try to summarize and make the conclusion based on just a few articles. And it's, of course, then sort of open to problems as well. But and in this way, I think that the whole point in the Economist paper was, in Economist journal, was to emphasize the need of being critical what you read, and also trying to be critical in the publication phase. And sometimes it's better not to publish at all if the quality is not there. But on the other side, then you have this amongst the scientists today, there is a huge pressure to survive, and that it's publish or perish. Because if you don't publish, then you don't get the grants, and then you are in trouble as a science professor.
So this really illustrates how the responsible quality assurance is a really important task of the whole scientific community, both in research and in publication. So do you have comments on this?
Well, just to remind that in the history it has been really a few very sad examples and even examples of violating the human rights. And so the scientific community needs to be awake and follow the highest standards of ethics. And that's, I guess, something that the universities should be practicing all the time, teaching the ethics to the future generations. And also inside the researcher community, there should be time to discuss the ethical issues, and the pressure to produce articles shouldn't be that overwhelming that there is no possibilities to reflect with your colleagues what is really right and wrong.
Okay, that's a good point, and that's a challenge also for doctoral education, how to include professional ethics of research in that field. So, David.
If I can add to what Harry was saying about in some ways, the demise of peer review, because there is both the pressure to publish among particularly young scientists, but the flip side of that is the lack of time scientists have to do the peer review. Traditionally, peer review was a voluntary activity that one contributed to the overall scientific enterprise, and people took it very seriously. And certainly that continues, but with the growth of especially open access journals, which what this article showed, the Science Magazine study showed, was really many of them are simply enterprises trying to make some money, that they will accept publications if you pay them. Naive researchers often don't understand that, and they will pay for that. It means that there are many, many articles out there that have gotten little or no peer review. And it's not to say that peer review, even good peer review, is not necessarily the answer. It catches certain problems and moves the enterprise forward. But clearly now you have a situation where there are many articles which have not been peer reviewed or peer reviewed in a perfunctory way, but are published. And therefore it's all the more important than to have these critical functions like Cochrane reviews, and there are others like that, that do that, because the individual consumer of the science, be it other scientists, be it policymakers, be it students, can't judge that very well. I mean, I can read an epidemiology study and pretty quickly identify certain types of errors. There are other ones I would miss, and there are certainly exposure assessment errors I would not see. And so it ends up being particularly challenging to put together this foundation for then setting policy. And so our challenges only increase.
Okay, so we still have some time for discussion, and I would like to open the floor to to the audience, there will be several speakers. And please introduce yourselves, because we have also the internet connection. First there.
Thank you.
Yeah. On to.
Okay, now, Kari Reijulo from this institute. I'd like to change the discussion from the quality of the research to the relevance of the research. I'd like to pick up one wicked problem which I've been working with, and that's the. I think all of the panelists have some touch upon this. It's the moisture problem, building moist and mold problem buildings. And David, this is very Finnish problem, and I think in the United States you also have mold problem buildings, but really not that much in workplaces. Wicked problem. 20 years ago, I would say, Minister Olli-Pekka Heinonen was actually raising a very good question, and was the first minister to raise up the question of Minister of Education of moisture problems in schools. And that was the very first project in this field of interest. And now 20 years later, almost all ministers have done something on their field of interest. And last year, this institute was actually giving a report or survey to Finnish Parliament, showing that what is the state of art at this moment and what shall we do. And now the Finnish Parliament was very, very concise about the unity, how to go further, and gave 40 proposals back to the ministers, to the cabinet. And I'm looking forward to see that what are the actions now when the Parliament is the one who makes the decisions how to go further. That wasn't the main issue, but that was the issue of relevance. 20 years after Minister Heinonen was proposing the question, we didn't know too much about this issue. Today we know much more about many things. What is causing moisture problems, what is the prevalence of the problem in Finnish buildings and such. But due to the thing that we have now very popular issue, moisture problems, many people are interested in that. And today, the relevant question is not what is the molecule that causing the disorder, what are the mechanisms of causing the disease. Certainly they are important, we are looking for that, we are doing that. But the relevant question is, what is the workability of people who after third or fourth or fifth try to get to a new building still have the symptoms. I would say that this is a kind of continuous symptoms of individuals in indoor environment, obviously not particularly having the problems due to molds, but something else. And what is now the multi-professional team who is able to give the answers to these questions? And this is a challenge to Mr. Heinonen. We need you again to do the job.
So, Olli-Pekka, do you want to reply or comment on that? Yeah. That's an example of a wicked problem, yes.
Yes, it is a wicked problem. My mind starts to kind of puzzle with the question that how should it be solved, and who's kind of, why isn't it solved? And I think one of the reasons for it is that we come up with the question that who's the owner of the problem? That there are kind of many sectors again that have a kind of a touch with the issue, but who really has the kind of ownership to get something done about it? And somehow I'm very kind of optimistic about solving wicked problems in a way of utilizing practical experiments, so that we kind of, on experimenting things, we gather the different kind of research aspects of the issue, And we also gather the kind of different kind of policy-making sectoral aspects on it. And we try to solve it on an experimental level together. And then if we come up with something that seems to be functioning and everybody is kind of ready to live with, and we're talking about actually solving the problem we are dealing with, then it's the question that can we kind of make it a more systematic change to bring it to another scale. And somehow I feel that we in Finland, we quite often try to do it the other way around. That we try to do it in a very kind of not very concrete level, and we try to solve it. We have a word in Finland for this, it's called hanke. And we, whenever we kind of, I've been in those rooms sometimes when there's a problem, and there's a kind of a tension in the room, and nobody knows what to do, and then somebody says, should we start a hanke? And then everybody's kind of relieved. Now it's solved. And then it takes 2 years with the hanke. And in practical life, nothing happens during those 2 years. But why I'm supporting experiments is also the fact that when we're experimenting, and if it doesn't work, we learn a lot. We know much more about the actual issue with the experimenting saying that this solution is no good than we try to solve it on a very abstract level.
Maybe you.
Thank you. I just try to answer Karileila's question. It has been very relevant from the point of view that we know that there is a problem and we know what is the problem. But to continue from this, how to solve that problem hasn't been so relevant. From my point of view, it would be perhaps Tampere University where municipal administration is studied. Because from my point of view, they are mainly municipal buildings where this problem exists. And it's up to the municipal administration to know that they have a problem and perhaps learn how to solve that problem. But for instance, we in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, we are not able to solve that problem. The real problem is in the municipal buildings and who is in charge of the municipal buildings. That's the person who is responsible for solving that problem. And if the research could help them understand this, it would be even more relevant.
Okay. So the next question here.
I'm Kiki Miller, head of the Brain and Work Research Center here at FIOH. I would like to comment or address the question that has to do with attitudes toward information. I feel that the more multidisciplinary research becomes, the more we are in the situation where we really should and have different viewpoints to research results and how to interpret them. And we also have contradictory and conflicting views. And now as internet is full of this type of information, data, then there's outdated data, outdated information, there's some that, is resilient and we've tested it with time and we can say it's knowledge. I think we are in some way afraid to address this question with both citizens and policymakers. We are afraid that they become anxious because information is contradictory. And so we end up by simplifying things. And I think this is one of the things that is going on, at least here in Finland at the moment. We have wicked questions, but we don't address them as wicked questions. We simplify things. And we are afraid that if we start saying that these are big problems, there's not only one or two answers or good ways to solve them. We think, oh, now the public becomes so anxious that, we just have to, keep this out of the media, or we shouldn't address these things. So in my point of view, we should, in fact, expose people from early on in every levels of, for instance, education and throughout their lives to this thing that we live in a world where we have a lot of changing information, and this is just a thing that we have to live with. And this has to do with the fact that we should very much, all of us, promote educating people through thinking, so that people develop their thinking skills and their ability to gather different type of information and to understand that it changes. Because I think this is one thing that we researchers have difficulties in sort of putting into words to the general public, that this is a fact of life and this is how it should be. And then I would like to give a short comment on what was addressed concerning this The Economist editorial. Another aspect that I think is becoming a problem is this huge and intensive rivalry and increasing competition within science. This public or perish, which is really a big issue, because the more you have to be in a speed mode, the faster you have to produce, for instance, reviews. You don't look at the research from many different viewpoints. You try to do everything as fast as possible. So then the risk of falsifying results or being in an information bubble and only coming out with certain type of research results, the risk for this increases. So these two things both have to do with information and how we at the moment tackle it and what our attitude to it is. And this was in some way a comment on the things that we were talking today about.
Thank you. Now I propose that we take the questions and then give the possibility of the panelists to respond. Here is one, and yes.
I do apologize, I didn't introduce my name earlier, it's Suvi Sajaniemi. I waited quite long before I heard the words concrete level and shop floor. I don't think science has any meaning in itself. I think the ultimate evidence-based proof is the shop floor, and I don't believe either in communication and education in itself. People have to have power to use that information. I give you one example. I went to a factory where there are people who were exposed to a lot of noise, and they knew perfectly well that it was on harmful level, and they even had some inspectors coming in, but the employer chose the day when the machines were in service, so there was not enough noise level. So people knew that they are exposed, they knew that it will be harmful. They asked the employer to give them safety gear. The employer chose the cheapest possible one, and in 1 year in that place they had 3 hearing impairment cases. So I don't know if you could, I would urge you to introduce science-based evidence how to improve people's powers so that they actually can tackle their shop floor problems. They are clever, Finnish people and everybody, any country, they are clever enough to see their problems, they know about them, but if they can't do anything about it, it's useless. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Okay, thanks. Hi, my name is Kai Puolanmäki. I'm a senior research scientist at the Institute, so my field is computational data analysis. And I was in a machine learning conference a couple of months back, and there was a talk by Ray Garni titled Using Machine Learning for Passing Machine Learning Powers for Good. So Garni is a known machine learning researcher, and for good was getting Obama re-elected. So this isn't a wicked problem, because I mean it's a specific objective and there was a time frame. But how they did it was that, I mean, they basically used scientific methods of kind of data analysis and experimentation to kind of direct the campaign. So they did randomized experiments, so they might call different people in a bit different way and see which way got them most donations and etc. So they were scientists doing kind of this kind of making operative decisions. And many of my colleagues do that in marketing, maybe somebody in lobbying, maybe someone in financial markets, but I don't know anybody doing this in kind of political decision making, which is a weird thing. And now this Garni, as I understand, so he's doing charitable things in Chicago area, so using these methods to like figure out how people get better education and something like this. And I think that, I mean, this is one way of kind of I view this as kind of one kind of way to interact between science and scientists, between politicians. So I mean, this is not kind of in a way evidence-based science, and it's not science because there is no kind of peer review, and the validation is in the result, does Obama get elected or not. But the methods are kind of scientific methods, and you need scientists to do that. And the time frames can be short, couple of days to weeks, as compared to years that it makes to take scientific research. And I just like to ask you that what is, I mean, your view of, I mean, so would this be a good way to interact between science and what is your view of this approach?
Okay, then we have at the back, we have, yes.
Actually, this is on the moisture and mold problem. And regarding the Leo, actually, I'm really thankful for occupational health, because the only authority, for example, in case of Espoo, we have also Koulujen Lukio High School and middle school, where you have 40% of the students self-sick, 30% of the teachers sick, and then there's no authority that could actually close down the building rather than occupational health. There's nothing done from the school administration side in the city, nothing from the healthcare side. And I think there's a huge problem actually in the country regarding a slow and grey epidemics where you have hundreds of kids involved in an epidemic, which is not seen by this, I would say, authorities who have control of how to do it. And the occupational health is the only authority having the power to close down the building, which had actually mold that is hazardous and healthy. Really bad for health.
Okay. And then yes, one. Yeah.
I'm Ilkka from the
yes, it is.
Ilkka from the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. I have a question for the panelists, because there has been a lot of opinions, but I would like to ask the question concerning the timing of the targeted actions. With the modern society, we have media which is putting forward very quickly some results. We have several examples of results. Maybe one group is producing something. Then there's a big buzz going on in the media, maybe in social media and so on. And that is maybe affecting also the policy decision making. Think about the normal curve of scientific evidence. It takes about maybe in a more the fastest way, like 3 to 5 years, but easily 10 years. And how do you see this type of because we have here people who are really then making the decisions, and you said that nowadays there's a lot of different issues and also stakeholders who are compromising the decisions, the policy-making decisions, and even the science. So I would like to learn about this issue and your opinions on the right timing of this issue.
So I know that Olli-Pekka Heinonen has a time pressure. So would you like to make some concluding remark from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. Very good questions and viewpoints. I totally agree with what Kitimila was saying about the challenge of simplifying things, and also with the question of how to live with knowledge creating uncertainty. And that pretty much actually refers to the last question about the right timing of decisions. In my list, that what are the special requirements for solving wicked problems, one was actually time. And that is exactly what I meant, that we have a kind of a attitude that we should have everything ready here and now. And that's not only, that's a challenge for the decision making and the pressure for making quick decisions it's very strong. And it's also a challenge a bit for the civil servants, because they have their responsibility when they are giving the proposals for decisions to the decision makers, that are they kind of up to date, and they have a responsibility of what they are suggesting. And as I've been following, for example, the kind of media scandals on policy issues around the existing government, I claim that in more than 50% of those scandals, this issue is strongly involved. It's involved, for example, in the way that there's unclarity that what is the role of the civil servants and the information that the decision is based upon. And it kind of clearly shows that as the kind of evidence-based policy-making process is changing rapidly and there are more actors with new types of role on it, we are not kind of, we're not familiar with it yet. We have not kind of adjusted to those changes, and we're kind of trying still to cope with the pressure of making fast decisions. So my point of view is that and that is a very difficult one, that of course it is the role of the decision makers also to explain why things take time, why it's not possible to make a decision tomorrow, but we have to wait. It's a difficult line, because on the other hand, we are experimenting situations where we have a lot of knowledge, for example, but because the problem is so difficult, we are waiting that if there still could be some more knowledge to help us to make the decision. And that's another perspective on the same issue, that sometimes there is a time when it's not a question of having more knowledge, but it's about making a decision. And so it's very hard to kind of balance between these different questions. Just shortly about the people's power to do things, and also about the way of how kind of on a shorter time period science and policy making could be more connected. I think what in the UK, what they are doing on developing steering mechanisms is extremely interesting. They have a project called Mindspace, and they have a special small institute which is, I think, called Behavioral Insight Team. And the main question that small institute is doing is that, because traditionally the policy-making steering mechanisms, they have been regulatory methods, and then there's been money, budget, steering. And now they are kind of trying to find out that what are the other steering mechanisms that strongly influence people's behavior, and how that kind of mechanisms, which are not so strongly bottom-down steering mechanisms, but more come close to the ideas of co-creation and kind of self-steering, could be utilized in different sectors, and that is something that I think we haven't done very much work in Finland either, because sometimes it could be the fact that regulatory methods and budgetary methods can be pretty inefficient and also very expensive steering mechanisms, and the same means could be met with other types of steering mechanisms. I'm sorry I have to leave, but thank you so much for having this opportunity of being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, before the other closing remarks, I would like to give the floor for a short statement by Jorma Rantanen.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to take too much of your time. I have a couple of questions to the panel, which has been, in fact, reflected here. Are we over-regulating or are we under-regulating in the present-day work life in USA and in Finland? Leo a little bit expressed the concern that he may over-regulate and punish the good boys on uncrowded basis. But my question to you, Leo, is what is our bias really? Are we biased to over-regulate and over-protect? Or what do you think that we have hundreds of thousands of workplaces who don't have time to inspect? And we know that the David's left-hand right curve, probably Finland is not that full of criminal actors, but almost criminal or ignorant actors are very many here. So my question is, what is our bias we should be afraid of? Over-regulating, over-protecting, or making protection and regulation more effective, and particularly making the coverage of implementation better? That's my question to Leo. This is also leading to underestimation or overestimation of risk. Are we in the bias to overestimate or underestimate the risk? And again, my question is, and you surely find the reason of my question, should we look, what is our bias in this respect? Same with the reporting of our events, accidents and diseases. Are we over-reporting or are we under-reporting? Because these are very important issues for policy, also practical purpose. Then we have an implementation gap, which have been discussed by many of us here today. In fact, I would like to ask whether this regulatory approach and inspection approach is enough. I strongly emphasize that it is badly needed and it should be totally covered. But it is enough when partly small-scale enterprises, self-employed and informal sector are coming in the picture. Should we need services which are giving first the helping hand and then you can go to inspect. Then you have something to inspect. So this is my second question. In Finland we have occupational health services which doesn't yet cover all, and it's also directed a little bit, let's say, inappropriate direction. But what Olli-Pekka mentioned, in fact, he described something which we probably could promote more, and I think David was also referring to that. It is intervention research, because that is just making, let's say, social laboratory experiments in the work life and try to learn from them. But do it probably not as, let's say, trivial pilots, but as very well controlled intervention research process. So these were my questions.
Okay, so we have brief concluding remarks from the panel. We start with Leo.
Thank you for the questions. I begin from the people's power. In the Finnish workplaces, there are 60,000 people nominated or elected or selected to take care of these powers that are in the law. I'm not so happy because those powers are not used by the employees themselves, but they are available for the employees if they want to use them. For instance, it's hard to get a safety delegate to be elected nowadays. 20 years ago there was a lot of candidates, nowadays there are not. But there are a lot of paragraphs in the law that are not in application. On the other hand, what can the authorities do? Well, we can help the schools in Espoo, for instance, but it's not possible for 400 inspectors to take care of all those 250,000 workplaces in Finland daily or in practice. We can make the employer to improve the situation. We can make the workplace to cooperate. But if they won't, then we have to tell the thing to the police. And according to my calculation, in Finland there are approximately 4,000 such workplaces that have to be reported to the police for the prosecution process. 4,000 out of those 250,000. It's much too, it's too many, but I think it's quite a good figure anyway. Then we come to the Heinosen's question as regards the implementation gap. Those who belong to police, they need police, they need the help from the police. But those who want to develop and those who want to put things in order, they need the helping hand, as you described. But I think it's not an enforcement issue. It's just, as you said, it's the need of helping hand, the need of services. And as I referred to, it's the occupational healthcare cooperation between the occupational healthcare services, the line organization, and occupational safety and health organization at the workplace. We know that 70-80% of the workplaces comply with this approach. 20% of the smallest enterprises do not comply. And all over the world, the SMEs are the problem. If you can solve it, I buy it here. Then, as regards the regulation, I'm not so worried about over or under regulation, but I'm a little bit worried about the outdated, detailed technical regulation. If you take, for instance, the VDU directive and compare the contents of that directive with the equipment that we have with us, they do not meet each other. So I'm a little bit worried about old-fashioned regulation that brings the violations to everyday life. We have to re-regulate, and we have to be very careful in re-regulating. And I'm a little bit worried of over-detailed technical regulation. As regards the risks, my point is not so much whether we under or overestimate. The real point is what is the real risk
for instance, in our law, there is a paragraph stating that you have to have a seat at the workplace. Now the research shows that sitting is more dangerous as not sitting. What's the real risk? We have to be very careful in putting into the law the risks. But when there are the real risks, it's better to overestimate the real risks, but not artificial risks. And my concluding remark is that there's a lot of good knowledge, wisdom, capital, for instance, in this institute. The real task is how to mobilize it in the need of, for instance, Olli-Pekka Heinonen, as he calls in the Friday evening and asks the solution for a wicked problem for Monday morning. Then I call to someone in this institute, and normally you can help us. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Riitta.
Okay, a few short comments. I believe in open information and sharing the knowledge. So if it's a long process or long project, you can well share the halfway results, and of course there is always the risk or threat of misunderstanding at least part of that information, but maybe it's worthwhile to take that risk. And anyway, it's good to have discussion, and later on you may have a chance to correct the false interpretations. But anyway, it's good to have involvement and participation and dialogue with different counterparts. And I think more and more people, as I already said, more and more people are ready and willing to accept that science these days can give 100% truth in rare cases. In fact, there is always a certain aspect of uncertainty, and we just need to live with that. Kitty made a good contribution, and when I have meetings with our trade unions, we very often speak of the high level of performance that is very often expected in today's working life. And well, I think it's the same for you researchers, because the researcher community is a very hard place and full of tough competition today. So watch your own health and safety. Kitty and your team, you are the best experts on brain work, but as we know, the brain needs some rest and some time to discuss with colleagues and be creative, and not to have so tough deadlines and tough. You need not be 100% productive day by day, or 120% productive day by day. So maybe that should deal with the researcher world as well. The best results you can give out when there are some lighter days sometimes, and time for the brain to be creative and have some rest, really. And also, like the institutions who give resources and finances to the research projects should understand that, so that the timetables are not unrealistic, and we are not driving our researcher community to burnout. Then about the regulation, well, I think we are more or less on the right path, and at least in Finland I wouldn't speak of under-regulation, no over-regulation, but maybe that the point that we should give more emphasis is how to put it in practice, and the competencies of the occupational health services, which are very good in Finland but are not optimal, especially when the world of work becomes more and more complex. We need to continue to educate the occupational health teams on issues like moisture and mold problems, or how to serve the small and medium-sized enterprises so that we have compact service models for these companies who cannot have a full team of human resource management. And well, we have been working on that, and it's in good run, I guess, as well. So it's been quite a lot of progress, but we are not quite in the final round yet.
Okay, thank you. And David?
Thank you. And since it appears I have the last word, let me again thank you for inviting me. Thank Harry and the Institute for asking me to join you today. I very much enjoyed today's presentation. And what I've learned from many of you here in Finland. Let me just end with 2 points. One is to come back on this question of separating out the science about the risk. I mean, measurement of risk is a scientific question, and that can be measured. But really, the lesson of tobacco is you don't want to have the debate over science replace the debate over controlling the risk. And that's what the tobacco industry figured out. If we could debate, you could debate the science for a long time, and if you have enough resources producing mercenary science, that debate will go on for a long time. The question is, given what we know about the risk, how do we perceive? And that's the tough question. That's the regulatory question that you're raised. And are we over-regulating or under-regulating? I think that's not the question. It's, are we regulating in a smart way? We can never regulate completely. The world changes rapidly. You have a much more flexible system than we do, and you're still behind, from VDUs. The two recent cases in the United States that have taken a tremendous amount of our resources from OSHA's point of view are cases where we issued citations against employers for after fatalities that we had no regulation about. One was at a facility called SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida, where a trainer was killed by a killer whale. And the SeaWorld says they had no indication that this was dangerous work. Of course, it's been several thousand years that we've called killer whales killer whales. So it didn't come as a great surprise, we thought. But we're in court, and actually we have spent a tremendous amount of resources trying to win that case, just because we think it's an example of saying that even though we don't have a regulation, you should have protected these workers. Similarly, with Walmart, another well-known company, we've been in court since 1998 on the case. We have a shopping holiday we call Black Friday, which is coming up next week. It's the day after Thanksgiving. In the United States, Thanksgiving, the day of holiday, it's always on a Thursday. And the following Friday, it's the last Thursday in November, and the next day begins the shopping season for Christmas. And what stores have done in the last few years is announced that if you get there at 5 in the morning, for the first hour, or perhaps the first 100 people who get in, can get a very low price on a television. And so thousands of people line up. And we had one case outside New York City where so many people lined up and there was no crowd control that a security guard who was actually, more than 3 meters in height. 2 meters. He was 6 foot. Translate feet to meters. 6'5". He was a big guy. Was crushed by the crowd. And we said to Walmart, we fined them. OSHA does not have big fines, $7,000, because they didn't have crowd control. And Walmart has spent at least $2 million fighting us, and we probably spent $1 million just on that case to make the case that employers have a responsibility, retail stores have a responsibility to control the crowd. Now, we don't have regulations in either case. So we need to think about regulations differently and to say what's really important first is that employers assess the risk. And second, that we have a process that they have to address the risk, and that involves their workers, and that may involve their communities, but certainly involves workers, and it's a public process because it's a public responsibility. And how that is implemented is a social question. It's not a scientific question, though we can evaluate it scientifically, but it's a question of the relationship of policy, politics, culture, and it sounds like you have a law or regulation in place that provides safety and health delegates, and we don't have that. But I'm interested to hear the implication that it's no longer effective, because the world is changing, and maybe that was effective 30 years ago when you had unions who workers thought about their unions differently. Issues of social capital have changed tremendously. On the other hand, we have a very open society in terms of the internet, and you could have, for example, situations where if someone saw a hazard, they could take a picture and put it on the internet. And that might have more power in changing what's going on in the workplace than having a delegate raise a concern in this place, especially a place where the workers aren't well unified. We constantly have to be thinking about different ways, both to issue our regulations in a way that move employers forward and that involve workers, the community, in ways that represent our current thinking. We've issued a proposal a few weeks ago which says that every employer will have to post their injury rates on the web. That's never been done in the United States. Needless to say, I've heard a little opposition from employers about this, but we've seen from other evaluations of other activities that sort of public disclosure changes behavior. Our Environmental Protection Agency has a program, it's called the Toxic Release Inventory, which says that manufacturers and facilities that store chemicals on site or that release them into the air or the water have to post every year how much chemicals, the quantity of the chemicals that are on site, and how much are released into the air and how much into the water. That alone has had a huge impact because no facility wants to tell the people in their community, this is how much we're putting in the air. And so as a result of that, their behavior changes. So we're trying to think about ways we can issue regulation that represents first the fact that we can't regulate every risk. We don't know those risks, and we'll never be able to do by the time we issue that regulation, it will delegate. And also how we can make this sort of dynamic process. So it's our challenge, and we're learning from each other, and I think there's great potential to get there. So I hope we'll be able to work together to figure out how to do this right. And thank you all very much.
So, thank you very much. So, I think the research day and this panel have really shown that research organizations like the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health have an important function of producing reliable scientific information, which is also relevant in political decision making and in the behavior of the citizens. So the last word it then goes to the director of FIOH, Harri Vainio.
So thank you, Ilkka, and thank you for the panel and all the presenters of this morning. I know that there's only one thing between the lunch and when David thought about this Walmart crowds. So I'm afraid of my security now. So I just have a couple of points which relate to this morning. The first point which I wanted to take up is this the fact what David was talking about. Be aware of mercenary science. Just be aware. And I think the other thing which relates to this, respect the conflict of interest. That should be known. Then I think from Jos Verbeek, I think the slogan very briefly would be that be aware of the quality of research. The systematic critical reviews are very important. That's not the only one and the only thing we need to do, but it's one very important thing which also helps the decision-making process. What we really know about the thing, what is the level of uncertainty we are actually involved. The third point is this point from Olli-Pekka Heinonen when he was saying that understand the value and character of knowledge, the aspects of uncertainty, the multidisciplinarity, reliability. I think these things should be understood when interpreting the science for evidence. Then he also used, I think, a beautiful slogan, which I like a lot: knowledge walks, shared knowledge talks. And here he gave this sort of Finnish kind of example of hanke approach, so that when we really don't want to make a decision, so then we say that we found we make a new project. And that gives us 2 more years to think about the things. Sometimes may be a good thing, but sometimes it may be actually just slowing down the processes. And the final point which I have is relates to, for instance, our institute, but not only our institute, but also other producers of knowledge. It is this pathway from knowledge to evidence and then to the practice. The steering mechanisms which Olli-Pekka Heinonen was talking about. And for instance, when we are discussing the next years to come, how we are working, I think that we should take very seriously the evidence knowledge management and see that how we can improve the situation from today. That we have a lot of knowledge, but we cannot mobilize it. And how we can get the knowledge to those customers who actually can use them. Be they the decision makers, be they the workplaces, practical people who are organizing work at the work level. And we as research organizations, we actually should not only think that the first part of this process, the production of knowledge is okay, but also that how we go further and how we can be assisting in the implementation phase. So now I think, thank you, David, for your traveling the 5,000 kilometers all the way from United States here. It has really been a pleasure to not only to hear your talk, but also to be, I have had the pleasure of spending some time with David, and I must say that David is a wonderful person. We really liked your company. And thank you for also other speakers of this morning. They have been very important, and hopefully you can see them then also in the internet later on. Thank you very much, and have a good lunch.